Hello everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Rowan Bailey. I'm Director of the Centre for Cultural Ecologies here at the University of Huddersfield, but I'm also Director of Enterprise and Knowledge Exchange, so very much interested in the good practice of woven in Kirklees and the ways in which it is doing engaging work with all kinds of communities and audiences across Kirklees. So this is kind of, an opportunity for the university to do some collective thinking with woven. So Deborah, allow me to introduce you, please. So Deborah Margo's work combines different disciplines, including sculpture and multimedia ephemeral installations. Her working process is conceptual and intuitive, so it's based on research, but it's open to accidents, so-called accidents. Time, change, and touch are preoccupations within her practice, and her current interests link her gardening practice with the making of textile-based sculptures. She's been developing dye gardens over the last 5 years on rural and urban sites, and making natural dyes and applying them to a variety of textiles. And recently she's been dyeing locally milled wools and integrating them into her knitted works. And I'd really like to welcome Deborah to today's talk. Over to you, Deborah, and we might pin you so that we can all see you before you share your screen.
Hey. Hi, everybody. I'm really struck by the changes in climate today, trying to imagine Kingston, Jamaica, as I talk to you from Ottawa, Canada. Ottawa is the capital of Canada. It's 2 hours away west of Montreal by car and 4 hours further west to Toronto, just to give you a sense. It's about 1 million people here. And when I look out my window around my screen, I do not see plant life. I see snow everywhere. It's -3 degrees and it's been snowing and will continue snowing until tomorrow. So our growing season is quite different in terms of Ottawa is known as the coldest capital in the world, colder than Moscow. We have winter for roughly 4 months of the year. We also have a very short spring. Sometimes it's 2 weeks if we're lucky. We have a hot summer and a fall. In the winter, we can go to as cold as -35 degrees Celsius. And in the summer, we can go as high as 35 degrees Celsius. So we have a really broad range of, in this particular area, of growing situations. Going to start briefly with something that is traditional now in this part of the world for the last 10 years. I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the unceded indigenous land on which I talk to you from is the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'm a first-generation Canadian. I was born in Montreal. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and my background, my family comes from Russia, Poland, Germany, the UK, Canada now, and is scattered all over the world. My father's family in particular was instrumental in coming to Montreal when they left due to the German Holocaust. I have a family here as well as other parts of the world. I'd say two of the questions that have certainly been part of my working process for a long time is, where do I belong? And where does my work belong? And I've been practicing as a visual artist since the 1980s. and have tried to explore as many different possibilities in trying to answer those questions. The talk today that I want to give you is focused mostly on gardening in my role both as a professional gardener and how it links to my practice as a visual artist. I'm also a professor, adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, where I teach sculpture and installation and contemporary art practices. And as I mentioned, I'm a visual artist. In terms of my identity working with natural dyes, it's very much of a recent chapter in my practice. I consider myself a beginning dyer. Very much the notion that came up in Lucille's talk that I feel very strongly about is materials and materiality. I believe in that conversation between myself and the materials. It's a dialogue. And what I love about the dialogue is I bring my will, and my will is constantly challenged by the material. The material is the boss. I'm the notion that I have some form of power over it is constantly broken, and my humility tested. So let's see if I can properly share some images I have for you.
There we go.
Okay, great. So what do we have here? The first talk that was given as part of by Mariana from Studio Cuckoo's really made an impression on me in terms of the personal side of her life that she decided to bring in. So I do want to bring in the bedrock of how I'm able to be in this world, which, yes, is my family. This was taken in October at my son Noah's 30th birthday celebration. He's at the table sitting. I'm on the right. And above Noah is Alexandra, his partner. On the left is my daughter Eva, and on above is my partner of 40 years, Mark. So as I mentioned, the bedrock, certainly the beginning of being able to answer the question of where do I belong? I belong within my family. And also what I've learned in having children and having a family is the small acts, how important they are, and the notion of paying attention. I hope you're seeing my second image. Could somebody please confirm?
Yes, absolutely. Second image, good.
Good.
Yep.
So then we're going to continue. So there's my family, but I'm also very much based, my artwork is based in having a studio practice. This is my studio in Ottawa, where I've been fortunate enough to work for 18 years. It is in an old school. I have the kindergarten classroom, which is fabulous. It has sinks in it, has lots of room. It has a good drain for all kinds of accidents as they happen. And it is bordering on a schoolyard where now there is an elementary school where students often come to play and often come to knock at the window to ask, what am I doing? So both a private space, but very much encircled by children who are growing and learning. My gardening practice starts around April and continues now into November. What I do as a gardening practice is I have about 25 to 30 clients in the Ottawa Valley region. Some of them are the work I do is just in the spring or fall. Some gardens I work on every week. Some gardens I consult, design, grow. So a broad range of different kinds of skills. I'm self-taught, but I do come from a family of gardeners. Both my grandmothers had extensive gardens. My mother continues to garden on the 22nd floor of an apartment building in the shade where she has high winds and yet has a garden full of plants. My brother runs a landscaping company in Montreal, so it seems to be a family tradition. I began in 2004 my own gardening business. I work mostly on my own, but I do have students, former students of mine from the university who often help me. My favorite assistant, Jake, has gone on to just complete a horticultural degree after finishing a bachelor's degree in visual arts. This picture is from Anne's garden that I've been working on for 3-4 years now. It borders on a street. It's about an acre of land. What she particularly wanted was to develop her front garden to get rid of all of the grass. And she has it's a very shady garden, but along the street, there's a band of sunlight that is roughly 1 meter wide by 20 meters long, and have been growing annuals there that give her the punchy, bright colors that she likes. I often try to make gardens that very much fit with what the client wants, what they're interested in, if they know what it is, or to find out what it is. In terms of Anne, she wanted color, bright pinks and oranges. I harvest the zinnia seeds every season and have enough to give to other clients for their gardens as well as Anne's, and in fact even use the flowers for my dye practice. I very much like using the base of the 25 to 30 gardens I look after each season to bring plants from one garden to another, or to trade plants between gardens, or to harvest plants and flowers for my own practice. So I see it as very generative. I see each garden very much as a self-portrait of the owner. They like particular things, they dislike particular things. The range is from vegetable gardens to annual gardens, perennials. I run the full course and have learned mostly by doing and a lot of reading. 2004 was the year that I started my gardening practice, but it was also the year that I made my first installation using plants. This was done at an artist-run gallery near where I live, Axneoset. That's been in existence for a long time. It was a project that I was invited to be part of. A landscape architect was inviting architects, landscape architects, and artists to make different kinds of gardens inside and outside. The one I chose to make, as I mentioned, was my first project working with plants, and turned out to be something that started in April and continued through November, which taught me a great deal about the time necessary for these projects. It's not 1 month, but it can be much more than that. I chose to grow scarlet runner beans because I was living in Little Italy in Ottawa, and it was a neighborhood of gardens where all kinds of different sites, small sites were used to grow a lot of produce. And one of my neighbors, when I moved to the area, gave me scarlet runner beans, understanding that, of course, I had to grow what she was interested in. So I germinated all the scarlet runner beans and brought them to the gallery, where eventually I took them outside. I collected a lot of trellis materials, basically on garbage days. Everything from hockey sticks to mops to old trees to old branches to baseball bats, to help build structures for the scarlet runner vines. My hope was to grow the vines over the course of the summer, and that they would reach the top of my structures. The site which I knew ahead of time, the soil was extremely depleted. When you dug, you came up with pieces of metal, bricks, all kinds of garbage was there. So the whole idea of even trying to grow was a test in itself. So the structures were built, and then the beans were planted, and they started to grow. Weeds that were allowed that were in the area, I kept, because I saw that as a way as replenishing the soil, of having some form of root activity starting to happen in very unfriendly soil. Because it was an open area to the public, the biggest issue that people were concerned about before the project started was vandalism. But I actually found that the community surrounding this area were extremely respectful. They, in fact, would often come to help me water or weed the gardens, often to give their opinions on how things should be grown, how I should be tending to things. So it very much brought in the notion of a garden on an abandoned site as being also a site for people to meet and to talk and to exchange. I was successful in growing the scarlet runner beans to the height I wanted. And in November, finally, was harvesting the beans themselves and the bean pods. This is a close-up of the Spanish, the vines, the scarlet runner vines. I collected them and ended up making them into a project that could be disseminated, that the beans could be disseminated. I gave them to people who came to the gallery with instructions on how to grow them in French and in English, because the part of where I was growing them is predominantly French. But the beans were also distributed across the country in my friend Cindy Deachman's magazine. It was the centerfold where we put samples of the beans. They were mailed out, and I was that year on the west coast of Canada and found the magazine being sold in a bookstore there. So the beans made it to different places across the country where they could be planted with instructions on how to grow them. This shows you the packaging I made for them, which was made out of cereal box liner paper that was then stitched together with thread with the beans inside. Another project involving plants was here in Ottawa at the Experimental Farm, which is run by the Department of Agriculture. There were 6 artists that were invited to make gardens over a period of time. I chose to look into 22 kinds of squash, which I grew in 2 sites. This was one site with wooden structures that were built, very much following the idea of 3 sisters, some of the indigenous ways of growing foodstuff, as well as building a tunnel out of horse fencing with rebar mounts where my different kinds of squash could grow. There was companion planting with tomatoes and marigolds of different kinds, and you can start to see the fruit of the squash growing below. Another view where very much the richness of squash, all different kinds of squash, was growing up the structures I had built. Again, concern was for vandalism, but particularly from animals. There are a lot of groundhogs that grow in the area. I actually found most of the garden did very well during the summer months. In the fall, when university students returned to school, there was some picking. It is an area where there are a lot of dog walkers, a lot of people who walk through for pleasure, and they really became the custodians because of their frequency of being there. And they would often talk to me about how things were growing, how they found the state of things, and were really the eyes again, and for taking care of this garden, and the decision to be able to exchange information, have conversations about growing and what were my intentions. This is part of the harvest. I had about 150 squash come out of this. And in September, asked 4 chefs in the city, 4 friends, to make their own recipes of squash soup. We had very different kinds of squash soup. Some of it was an invented recipe. Somebody else did more of a Thai-based soup. Another one was with barbecued squash with different, with a broth made from the squash. This was served on the end of the exhibition. About 250 people came to participate in eating squash. A local bakery donated bread. So it was a real way to celebrate both the harvesting season as well as the end of this project. People eating the soup on the grounds of the experimental farm, which brought the project to a close. Very briefly, a few projects I've been working on. I have a collaborator now called Annetta Hagel. We've been working together since 2015. We have very similar interests in growing gardens and plant life. However, my expertise comes more from working with materials, whereas hers has, besides being an incredible gardener, she's very knowledgeable in terms of the media arts, which has everything to do with using film, digital imagery, recordings. So we've been able to use that kind of knowledge together of our different areas. And the collaborative process is very different than working on one's own. One has to have a real communication going and a trust in different ideas coming together. This project is in the abandoned schoolyard at the time of where our studios were located. And there is a school now operating, but our first project was in the abandoned schoolyard, where we tried to grow a garden in the cracks of the asphalt. It was called Asphalt Oasis. And here is Annetta trying to plant seed in the cracks with the weeds growing between the cracks. To be able to get the seed in, we often had to use a chisel to loosen up the earth and to insert the seeds. We found that it was not easy going. There were squirrels, chipmunks, and what we discovered, skunk eating the different seeds, but we still managed to make a garden. Some of the plants in the cracks, some of them in containers, some of them growing in repurposed rice bags. We had strings running through the abandoned schoolyard with plants growing up them, and a real chance at changing this space. We showed it to the public on a Nuit Blanche event. There are these events where you have different art groups that show work for one night. This is a part of the success of growing sunflowers in the cracks. For us, having sleeping bees hanging out with the sunflowers was a real sense of accomplishment. And the night of Nuit Blanche, when we had people from the city coming to visit this, our installation, turned out to be a stormy September night, but people still managed to come through. At night, we had projections that had pictures of documenting the garden at all different times of the 4 months that we had worked on it. 2 more projects with Annetta. This was tracking bumblebees culture. We built in the City Hall Gallery a installation made out of sedum plants, as well as grow lights, nectar pod sculptures based on the tiny nectar pods that bumblebees actually make and live in and collect their nectar in. We had bee songs that we had recorded in a field. The light system went on and off depending on whether it was night or dusk. And it was an immersive exhibition in terms of smell of the earth, the sound coming through, the different pods we'd made were out of beeswax, and because they had a little bit of heat coming from them with the sound amplifiers in them, it would actually heat the beeswax a little bit, so you had beeswax scent coming through. This was up for 3 months, and we ended up having to take care of it. We were there about 3 times a week watering it. Sabrina and Sarah, both investigating at the opening. It was a installation to touch. The grow lights that helped the plants survive in the gallery. A close-up of the sedum carpets with one of the nectar pods. The sedum came from a sedum farm. They were carpets of sedum that are used usually on roofs. In this case, we draped them over wooden structures that we built, and a close-up of the variety of sedum. The latest project that I made with Annetta was at a gallery here where we were investigating migrant workers that come to Canada to work on farms, in this case, in vineyards that are in the area. They come from Jamaica, they come from Mexico, many parts of the world. They come to live here for the harvesting season, are not recognized as being people who come back over and over for generations often. It was an examination of these people who are here, very present and very isolated when they come to work on the land here. We included images of the vineyards where there are trailers where they live, as well as making a screen out of repurposed fire hose where we projected images of vineyards and the picking of the grapes in this case. We worked with the workers harvesting grapes one season to get a sense of the backbreaking work that is involved in coming to Canada and of what it is like to be here working. It's a close-up of the actual fire hose screen that was woven, that we wove. And this shows the bottom of the screen with rolls of the hose that it can be adapted to different sites. And this is a project we're continuing to work on in terms of issues of food sustainability and security. I'm also working with moss from an abandoned lot near where I live. That was formerly a gas station, so the ground is quite toxic, but the moss survives, learning about how it grows. I've been growing it on boulders, limestone boulders in my studio. Originally, I set it up lights, watering systems, humidification, greenhouses in my studio because I was doing this in the winter. I learned that all my careful research did not work. It failed. The moss was dying, which was not a great feeling, but I learned that it actually grows much better next to my window, wrapped in plastic sheeting that I water every once in a while. So here's one of the plant meat pack, food pack that I took out of the garbage and kept different mosses in that I tried bringing back to life, which successfully happened in my new way of wrapping it up in plastic and leaving it to do its own thing with heavy humidification coming from both watering it and from making keeping the moisture inside with the plastic sheeting. And a close-up of the moss growing in my studio. Tiny systems of growth that continue to survive with no root systems, and the notion of how they rest, how they're dormant, how they do not die, but how to bring them back to their full greenness, how to give them the right situations for growing. Annetta has also continued on doing research that I have helped her with, growing flax. This was last summer. She tested 2 kinds of seeds, one from Nova Scotia, well east of here in what's called the Maritimes, which grew on the right, and on the left seed that was purchased from a weaving group here in the Ottawa region, and growing flax from seed, from germinating it all the way through to harvesting it, and trying to bring back that knowledge of how to grow flax and to hopefully eventually begin to make it into linen. In this case, Annetta figures the amount of flax that she grew once properly harvested and properly processed would make enough perhaps for a tea towel. Okay, briefly, who is this guy? This is my father, Peter, 92 years old. I bring him in to move into knitting. Knitting has been a practice of mine since I was very young, when my mother taught me how to knit. My father is wearing the hat I made him. It was one of my gardening clients who actually gave me a lot of wool in around 2016 from her father, who had died, who had been a medical doctor, but who was a knitter in his free time. And I was given bags of wool and books that really changed my notion of what knitting could be. I'd always thought of it as a hobby, but instead decided to move it into being part of my art practice. I was traveling for 4 months and with my family, and decided to work on a project that was based on colors I was seeing in different places, on wool that I would buy in different places that reflected the locale of where I was. This was in Europe. We visited 21 different places as a family, and I collected wool as I went and knitted as I went. They're very much European sources, from things from whether it is being in Prague, walking the stone patterns of walkways out of tiled stones, or being in the Alhambra, where the whole history of tile design and pattern influenced the knitting. So I was able to do this project anywhere where I was, stuffed into a knapsack, sitting, waiting for a bus, or getting on a plane. It was something that could be done wherever I was. So came back to Canada and continued working with the drawings, photographs, and the wools that I had, and made them into a series of scroll-like sculptures. When they were shown in 2013, they were pulled in different directions, as if they were traveling. They're each supported by wooden spindles that I turned myself out of maple and pine, both woods that are easily found here in Canada. This is the work from the influenced by the Alhambra. Most of the wool is wool fibers, not all purchased. At this point, I was not dyeing my own wool. This is the color of beginnings, where different episodes would cause different places I've been, where like each section was a different image or a different pattern from a different locale. A close-up of the knitting. It really became about playing with the knitting needles and with the wool, with no garment in sight, no garment, no wish to make a hat or sock. And it became something much closer to painting that I hadn't done in a long time. And color came back with a vengeance. Here again, the second room with some of the different works in the different scrolls and how they were hung through space. You could walk around them as the viewer, and very much the sense of them being pulled through the space. On the back side, if you call it the back side, some people preferred the back side to the front side. I had a system of dowels with plastic cups on each end that pulled the scroll so that it was pulled out. It had some tension to it so you could see the different surfaces. Another one on the floor, the color of waiting. I also at the time inherited from an aunt who had died suddenly her fabrics collection, a good portion of her fabric collection. She had been a clothing designer as well as maker, showed her work in different collections across the United States, did her own shows, trunk shows. Her fabrics were hand painted and ranged from working with silks to wools to velvets, mostly hand painted, again with more not natural dyes, but the kind of patterning that she was interested in, and her color palette were amazing. The contents of her studio went to 11 different people. I was lucky enough to get about 3 very large garbage bags full of different pieces. And when I brought them back to the studio for the first year I had them, I took them out and sorted them, trying to get to know them. They filled my studio, as well as her perfume, for the first 5 months. So there was a very much of a bittersweet sense to being very aware of somebody else's aesthetic of color and pattern, wanting to honor it, wanting to work with it, and being overwhelmed by it at the same time. I started by taking the remnants that had some form to them and very minimally changing them by hemming them and lining them. So this is one piece that I used where I didn't change any of the patterning, any of the color, but worked with the cut shape that had been given to me. And this is about 1 meter long by roughly 1 meter wide. It was from pashmina wool, and you can see some of the fringes that have been incorporated into the piece, as well as the very much painted fabric that I was given, as well as how it interacts with the wall. The wall was very much part of this very organic form. Another piece, again, made out of pashmina painted wool, very much playing with the cut piece as I found it. I became really interested in how the color was in the fabric versus, as we find with painting, where paint is on a surface more than in a surface or in the actual fibers. I came across this book, Harvesting Color by Rebecca Burgess, who has been very influential in the States for the whole notion of fiber shed and natural dyes. And it was a revelation to me, the notion of bringing together color, fabric, and growing plants. The notion of bringing together my art practice and my gardening practice. The first year of coming across this book, I read it and I started doing research online. The problem with the book was many of the plants did not have anything to do with my region, much more with the southwest of the States, which is much warmer than where I live. So although the ideas were very good and the beginning of the information was very helpful to get me started, it was also frustrating. I decided to grow my own dye garden, where I had been given a commission to do for the municipal gallery. So I had a small budget that allowed me to buy a cubic yard of earth and to gather pots into that I filled with earth and germinated a range of plants. Here are the plants growing in my garden. There was a range. They were all annuals at this point because that's where I decided to begin, things that I thought I could grow quickly. So a lot of zinnias, marigolds, coreopsis. So our growing season is short. We tend to take things outdoors around Victoria Day, which is mid-May. And even then there can be frost at night. Growing season can go well into September if one's lucky. So as we stand now in February, nothing can be planted until really mid-May. So we've got a long way to go still for our season. This is in August where things were going very well, a range of different plants. And at the time, I both collected seed, which has been something I've done for a long time, and also began later on making dyes. I started foraging in different places that I was visiting. This was in the Maritimes in New Brunswick, where in August there is a lot of goldenrod growing. And yes, I do very much believe in ethical foraging. It's something that I hold very close to my practice. I started my dye learning by harvesting different plants in a region and really seeing what color could I get from them. This is a selection in the Maritimes in New Brunswick that I was testing. for different possibilities. Again, some barks, the goldenrod, there was different kinds of rudbeckia, horsehair, some birch leaves, and I was very much a novice trying to figure out the process as well as what results could I get. Lots of oak acorns for tannin base was easy to find. We have a lot of oaks. I started being able to pinpoint where there was a lot of oak acorns to gather, which turned out to be some of my customers' gardens where they didn't want them in the soil. So it was a way to take them out and use them for what I needed them for tannins. As well as at City Hall, I even found an amazing oak tree that had a lot of wonderful acorns. So it became about walking and looking and finding. In 2017, I attended a residency which combined food and art. And this was a time where I really had a chance to just focus on foraging and dyeing. It was really a watershed period for me because I wasn't teaching, I wasn't gardening for that period of time. And the book that most helped me at that time, which was recommended by my friend Carl Stewart, who's a wonderful dyer and weaver and artist, was Vile Color by Jenny Dean. And it's been recommended to me by, in a number of workshops I've been. There are more plants in Jenny Dean's book that are that I can find in my area with very good growing instructions, as well as extraction, as well as just overall learning. So I have found it a very useful book to recommend to people beginning to dye. Another book that is a wonderful source of inspiration is Jason Logan's making. Jason Logan is a forager and ink maker, lives in Toronto, but is an illustrator, has a wonderful weekly newsletter free of charge. He's a beautiful writer, includes poetry and storytelling, as well as ink making. He's a believer that you can make ink out of anything. It can be cigarette butts gathered outside with wild grapevines. He is an experimenter and investigator extraordinaire. Recently, in the last 6 months, his first film has come out where he talks about different and interviews different makers of ink from all over the world and their practices. At the residency, which was in Prince Edward County, again, a wine growing area where I learned about the migrant workers, we had access to a chef's garden where for volunteer hours, we could work on the garden, helping to look after it and forage food stuff and dye stuff from it over the period we were there. So this is a view of the garden that had both flowers and food stuff. A selection of dyes. I just started cooking everything and testing it just to see what it could give me. I worked with fugitive dyes. I worked with more permanent dyes. It was just a real love for me of seeing what could I extract, what kind of color was available from the plants where I was. I began my own dye book where I was working with 3 kinds mostly of fibers, mordanted silk, cotton, and linen, and finding out how differently each fiber would take the same color, and learning to take notes and learning to keep track of both when and where the different dye plants come from. Also learning when I return the next year that one dye plant and one growing season are different from each other. You can have the same plant that grows one year to the next and gives you completely different color results in terms of strength of color, depending on the weather. Was it a summer of drought or was it a summer of rain? Those have impacts on your color and on the plant. My first project at this residency was to make, out of cotton that I mordanted, serviettes. very banal, but because we were making food together and talking about food and practices of making food, it seemed to be the right thing to do, relevant to the project. So the different cotton napkins were dyed with plants that I found in the region, different things that I experimented with, whether it was sumac or juniper berries. And they were given at the end of the residency as gifts at the final dinner that we had together. They were folded and with different plants from the area that I had gathered inside the serviette. So just showing you the dinner table with the different serviettes on each plate. And a selection of dyes were next to them, as well as the dye book that I had been working on throughout the residency. The second part that came from gathering the different plants I had grown in my own garden was a commission for the Ottawa Art Gallery that was celebrating its opening of its new building. It was a commission project, and I selected one of the main staircases to install my work. It was my experimenting in the studio with different dyes that I made from my dye garden, and learning through the process of exhibiting the work how it could be changed by light, how colors were vibrant, and depending on what the plant was, how some of them faded and how some of them didn't fade. The whole notion of what permanency means when it comes to natural dyeing. The installation went through the area of the staircase. It could be seen as you were on the stairs or on the landing. There were airplane cables strung throughout the spaces. The fabrics were linen, silk, raw silk, linen that had come from a friend who had originally been given it by her grandmother, came from her grandmother's trousseau, where the grandmother had grown the actual flax and then woven it as part of her dowry. So there was also cotton, a range of colors, really exploring the warmer tones of yellows, pinks, browns. They were sewn together, as well as magnets, holding small earth magnets, holding them on the airplane cables. Layered, a little bit of imprinting from some of the plants. Some of them were high above the viewers, some of them low down, some of them at the window that bordered onto the terrace. And on the terrace were many of the dye plants that I had grown in my garden, making them a small dye garden as part of the exhibition. And which meant that somebody had to look after them. The curators took it on. They were happy to have a change from being in their offices and coming out to the terrace and looking after the plants. Further on, towards the end of the exhibition, I gave a series of workshops to children where we were exploring the harvesting of dye plants from some that I'd harvested for them and some that they harvested from the small garden I'd made, where we played with the making of dyes and the dyeing of them with different textiles. In 3 hours, you can do a lot with children. It's fast-paced. The cooking is fast-paced, the cutting, all of it. They can safely cut with scissors and safe knives. Start their dye batches. They are enthusiastic learners, very much experiential, and the potency of being able to take plants that grow locally and extract color before their eyes. I moved 4 years ago to a small house and started my own dye garden, much smaller than other ones I've had in the past, but even local small gardens in front of one's house. This one's about, I'd say, 8 meters long by maybe 3 meters on a good day wide. First year was able to get results with tansy, marigolds, of course, and cosmos. Very quickly started having some dye plants to play with. Also have started being at the local community garden where I grow vegetables, and another community I'm very part of growing. I write the newsletter and take pictures of different things growing and bring up different topics that are of interest to the different people that grow vegetables mostly. Though I live adjoining downtown, the area I live in is right next to the Ottawa River. And there are a lot of wonderful meadow-like landscapes to walk through that are extremely inspirational in terms of what's growing there. So this is about 2 minutes walk from my house. Bike paths, again, ethically foraging is a possibility because there's a lot of plant stuffs to pick in the fall. Again, you're 2 minutes from downtown, but have landscapes like this adjoining the river, known as the Rideau River. Sumac, staghorn sumac grows plentifully. Berries can be picked. Wonderful dye plant. A bouquet of flowers that I got from the area. The contents of my pockets, both from gardening as well as walks that I take. I always am finding things. Spent flowers become stuff for dyeing. Because so much of what I learned was on my own, there were a lot of lags in my education and a lot of questions that I had. And finally, last January in 2022, I was able to take an intensive online workshop with Mel Sweetman is her name. She does a series of what she calls modules on natural dyes. Her school is called Mammy's Schoolhouse. She gives online workshops. Before the pandemic, she did in-person more, but these online workshops they go at your own pace. She has a series of videos. She does Zoom calls. She has incredible didactic materials. She meets with people, and most important for me, she is willing to answer any question you ask. The first module finally got me to understand how to scour properly, how to mordant properly. The second workshop was a deep dive into some of the grand teintes, different dyes, whether it be indigo or madder or weld. She is a fountain of incredible information with a strong chemistry background, which I found extremely helpful in terms of understanding pH, understanding all kinds of how an indigo vat can work and when it doesn't work, really demystifying so many things because so much of the learning materials that exist out there is varied and you get very conflicting information. Her modules, the people who attend them are from people from all over the world. In the module I took, there were people from the UK, from Hawaii, from different parts of Canada, the States. So she has very far reach. She lives in Cape Breton, which is in Canada, very far to the east, where she lives in a rural environment that often has weather turbulence with electricity down, but she is a master teacher and also an artist, as well as having her own practice. So when I started in January last year, she asked us to gather tannin materials directly from our own place to really do portraits of our own landscapes. It was January. This is the river frozen over where you can go, where I was able to go cross-country skiing or walking. And I thought, what am I going to find in the middle of winter? Much to my surprise, I found a great deal of things that were open for the tannin exercise I'd been given, which was to find out, first of all, could you extract a tannin and what was its potency? How strong was it? Could it be used for mordanting, particularly of plant-based fibers. I came back with a range of oak leaves, maple leaves, acorns, all kinds of different things, and was able to extract a whole range of different colored tannins, which had different strengths, and very much gave me the sense of being able to understand that there is always color available in an environment. Just a view quickly of some of the hundreds of samples that I learned to make of all different colors, from blues to yellows to purples to blacks to reds. My greens aren't good yet. That's something I want to continue working on, although I certainly understand much more about having to dye, layering through dyeing of yellows and blues. Dye garden from last year that I started as a volunteer with under the auspices of the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum, which is about an hour outside Ottawa. It is in one of the mills that originally existed here. The coordinator of that project is Melanie Girdwood-Brunton, who was an educator at the museum. She wanted to start a dye garden, and we did so through volunteers. I helped plan it, help plant it, help harvest, as well as at the end of the season do an initial dye workshop with some of the beginnings of plants that had been harvested. So here you can see some of the coreopsis, some of the tansy that grew. Some of the plants will mature more this year. There's madder, there are hollyhocks. The soil is heavy clay. We were very concerned about drought last year, whether the plants would survive. They did. It wasn't a dry summer, so we'll see the dye garden will continue this year. Again, it's a volunteer project with people coming to weed, plant, harvest, water on land that was donated for use by a food bank. This is at the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum at the workshop that I gave last fall, where we worked with a number of the plants, woad obviously, because woad grows very easily here. So some blue that we were able to extract. Preparing the plants from the different people. The workshop was mainly for volunteers who would come to actually had worked on the garden. Marigold dyes, coreopsis dyes, and very quickly some works of mine that show some of the learnings I've been doing with textiles leading into dyes. These are tea towels that I've repaired with some of the papers that were given to me and fabrics that were given to me by my aunt. Another tea towel that was mended into its own artwork. A series of very small works that are roughly, let's see, in 21 centimeters high by 14 centimeters, very intimate, with scraps of cloth. The whole notion of shmata, or what is the value. Shmata is a Jewish Yiddish word for rag. Is a rag precious? Is it something to savor? Is it something to hold on to, or something to throw out? So scraps of material that are sewn to paper bases with pastels, oil pastels. Again, more of the shmatas, the rags. How shmatas or rags or remnants of, in this case, naturally dyed cloth, cotton, wool, and linen are repurposed and restitched together. A recent work finished last month, again, quite intimate, where there is color from natural dyes on cotton and on paper, woad, madder, and a number of other dyes that are sewn to a wood paper base, the back, all the threads, that it tells its own story. Wools that I've started this past fall dyeing from local mills, from people I met who grow They have their own sheep and have their own mills, have started milling their own wool, starting to dye them with my own gathered colors with woad, in this case on the right, and actually cochineal that had been given to me by a friend. Mixing them with wools that I already had. So mixing both more synthetic wools with naturally dyed wools into a scarf I'm knitting, a double knit scarf. That's taking forever, but still happening. A close-up of what that looks like. Colors from a friend of mine, Barbara, who I'm making a sweater for. She selected the pattern and the colors. I dyed most of the wool. And this is the beginning of the sweater, showing some of the dyed wool with it. And the prototypical Canadian image of maple leaves to show you I am at the end. And I'm sorry, I've taken a little more time than I expected, but wanted to give you the full taste of gardening and the beginning of dye practice. Thank you for your patience.
Deborah, absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. And as you were going through your beautiful work and talking about your projects, I suddenly realized we've got a friend in common. So you know Michelle Govertz?
Oh, well, that's how I found out about the group. She told me about you.
Oh.
She said, well, you know, you have to check this out.
So yeah, lovely to see the project of the Ottawa Art Gallery. Thank you so much.